We tend to imagine that the end of democracy is a dramatic, cinematic event. The prevailing fear is that totalitarianism arrives overnight, breaking down the doors of a free society with overwhelming, unstoppable military might. The historical record shows a much quieter reality. Authoritarians rarely have to break in. The architects of these regimes are typically elected, appointed, or otherwise welcomed through the front door by the very societies they eventually dismantle. A single leader, or even a single political party, lacks the sheer administrative capacity to subjugate a modern rule-of-law state on their own. To build their machinery, they require a cooperative ecosystem. They need the active, daily assistance of the population. The collapse of a democracy is a predictable, mechanical sequence. It unfolds through a three-stage cascade of psychological and structural compliance by ordinary people. The cascade begins in the public sphere, within the visual landscape of daily life. Symbols begin to appear that quietly divide the population, signaling who belongs and who is excluded. In 1933 Germany, party members started painting the word Jewish or Aryan on shop windows. Initially, many citizens simply looked on, but accepting these markings as a natural part of the street altered how people calculated their household economics. A shop marked Jewish suddenly had no future. That physical marking acted as a psychological trigger. A passive prejudice against an outgroup was leavened by the prospect of financial gain. Property was suddenly vulnerable, and neighbors began to covet the businesses of the people being pushed out. Decades later, the dissident thinker Václav Havel observed how symbols sustain oppressive regimes, even when no one believes in them anymore. He offered a parable about a greengrocer who hangs a communist slogan in his shop window. The grocer doesn't endorse the slogan. He puts it there simply to blend in and avoid trouble with the authorities. When an entire population follows that exact same logic to avoid friction, the streets become blanketed with displays of loyalty. Citizens who accept these signs as normal, whether out of greed, fear, or exhaustion, create a false consensus that pre-authorizes the regime's future violence. Once the public culture is softened, authoritarians have to capture the state's actual institutions to execute their vision. A dictator cannot hold a show trial without an obedient judge. They cannot run a concentration camp without business executives seeking cheap labor, or conduct inhumane experiments without compliant physicians. To bypass the rule of law, they require the professional class to abandon its ethical codes. Take Hans Frank, who served as Hitler's personal lawyer before becoming the Governor General of occupied Poland. Frank argued the law was meant to serve the race. That perversion was the intellectual cover German bureaucrats needed to enforce projects of destruction. Professional ethics exist precisely to guide people when they are told a situation is exceptional. Without the meticulous paperwork, legal frameworks, and logistical support provided by highly educated civil servants, authoritarian ambitions remain strictly theoretical. Most governments maintain a strict monopoly on violence. Democratic politics function because only the state can legitimately use force, and that force is constrained by law. When agencies outside the law gain access to violence, the system breaks down. Regimes looking to undermine democracy routinely fund violent parallel organizations. Groups like the Nazi SS started as party-specific security details, clearing meeting halls and creating a climate of intimidation outside standard legal boundaries. The fatal blow lands when these paramilitaries intermingle with the official police and military forces. The regular armed forces are challenged, then penetrated, and finally directed by the irregular guards. The sheer scale of the 20th century's worst atrocities, from the Holocaust to the Soviet Great Terror, could not be achieved by specialized killers alone. These campaigns required the manpower of thousands of regular police officers who followed irregular orders simply because they were afraid to stand out. The ultimate enforcement of tyranny is rarely executed by cinematic monsters. It is carried out by ordinary conformists in uniform who decide to go along with the new rules. Authoritarianism relies entirely on this sequential chain of obedience: the quiet surrender of the everyday citizen, then the professional, and finally the policeman. When regimes fall and the dust settles, the defense of just following orders offers no protection. History, and the courts that follow, hold the individual strictly accountable for participating in unlawful actions. To stop the cascade, the resistance has to be as deliberate as the compliance. If you see signs of hate and exclusion in your public sphere, do not look away. Remove them yourself before they have the chance to normalize. If you belong to a profession, firmly defend your institutional rules and ethical commitments, especially when political leaders set a negative example. It is incredibly difficult to subvert a state if the lawyers and civil servants refuse to process the paperwork. And if you carry a weapon in public service, be deeply reflective about the orders you receive. Be explicitly ready to say no the moment you are asked to do something irregular. The momentum of a tyrannical movement feels unstoppable when everyone is adapting to it. But that spell of the status quo is deeply fragile. It shatters the exact moment one individual decides to set an example, endure the unease, and stand out. In the United States, we tend to treat our democratic heritage as an automatic shield. We assume that because we have the Constitution, a set of defined rights, and a system built on laws, we are naturally protected from tyranny. The men who actually wrote that document did not share that confidence. The Founding Fathers spent their time obsessively studying the ancient democracies of Greece and Rome, specifically because they saw how easily those republics collapsed into oligarchy and empire. They designed our system of checks and balances because they knew human beings were deeply flawed. The goal was to mitigate those imperfections and prevent a single individual or group from usurping power from the inside. They weren't celebrating a perfect system. They were trying to build guardrails against a highly fragile one. This chart shows the three major waves of democratic expansion in modern European history. You can see peaks after World War I in 1918, World War II in 1945, and the end of communism in 1989. Following almost every one of these peaks, the markers plummet. Many brand new democracies collapsed directly into authoritarianism. We like to think we are wiser than the citizens of those European democracies that yielded to fascism in the 1920s and 30s. The historical record suggests otherwise. If we want to understand how a democracy actually dies, we first have to unlearn three fatal assumptions we currently hold about how tyranny operates. The first assumption is that dictators seize power through overwhelming force, conquering a populace that is actively fighting back. Historian Timothy Snyder points out that most of authoritarianism's power is freely given. He calls this anticipatory obedience. In uncertain times, individuals think ahead about what a new repressive government might want, and they offer it up without even being asked. Look at Austria in early 1938. As German forces threatened annexation, ordinary Austrians didn't mount a fierce resistance. Instead, without any direct orders, many spontaneously performed the Nazi salute, forced their Jewish neighbors to scrub the streets, and stole their property. By eager and voluntary conformity, these citizens actively taught the high Nazi leadership what atrocities were socially acceptable, paving the way for the Holocaust. The propensity for this behavior reaches far beyond 1930s Europe. In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram designed an experiment to test the limits of human obedience. Subjects were instructed to apply electrical shocks to a stranger in another room whenever that stranger answered a question incorrectly. Even as the victims pounded on the glass and complained of heart pain, most subjects followed the instructions to apply supposedly lethal shocks simply because a new authority figure instructed them to. Grave tyrants do not start with total control. Their power grows from the ground up, built on the heedless, instinctive conformity of everyday citizens. The second assumption is that our established institutions, the courts, the press, the legal system, are effectively on autopilot and will inherently protect us from a rogue leader. In February 1933, shortly after Adolf Hitler formed a government, a prominent newspaper for German Jews published an editorial. They wrote that Hitler's radical proposals would naturally be held in check by ethical reflection and existing political powers. It was a perfectly reasonable and perfectly fatal miscalculation. Authoritarians rarely destroy institutions entirely. Instead, they use a tactic the Nazis called Gleichschaltung. They leave the shell of the institution intact, but deprive it of its vitality and function. They turn civic organizations into hollow simulations that exist only to gird the new regime. This hollowing out happens fast. By the end of 1933, less than a year after that hopeful newspaper editorial, Germany was fully consolidated as a one-party state, with all of its major institutions humbled and weaponized. Institutions cannot protect themselves. If citizens do not proactively defend them from the very beginning, they fall one by one. The third assumption is the belief that if things get bad, the public can simply vote the problematic leaders out in the next election cycle. The historical reality is blunt. Any election can be the last meaningfully free election of a voter's lifetime. When Germans voted in 1932 and when Czechs voted in 1946, the majorities did not realize they were casting a ballot to end democracy. They assumed the mechanics of voting would always be there. This graphic demonstrates what historians call salami tactics. Once an authoritarian party wins an election and takes office, they systematically slice off layers of political opposition, one piece at a time. While the public is distracted by spectacles or outmatched by new laws, this slicing continues. Eventually, the diverse layers of a multi-party system are reduced to a single monolithic block. The ballot box is only a safety net if the winning party respects the rules of democratic elections. Otherwise, it is a trapdoor. The overarching lesson of the 20th century is that democracies rarely die from a dramatic external invasion. They expire in plain sight, through internal rot and the quiet cooperation of ordinary people. Early Americans often said that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. They did not mean scanning the horizon for foreign enemies. They meant watching our own politicians, guarding against those who would exploit American freedoms to end them. Snyder offers a few immediate directives for citizens. First, do not obey in advance. Do not voluntarily offer your submission to a repressive authority before they even ask for it. Second, choose one institution you care about, a court, a newspaper, a labor union, and make it yours to defend. And actively protect the multi-party system by participating in local elections. History does not repeat, but it does instruct. The mechanics of tyranny are well documented. It is entirely up to us whether we choose to listen to the past before the experiment fails.
We tend to talk about fake news, alternative facts, and social media bots as if they are modern glitches, unique side effects of living in the internet age. But these are not new bugs in the system. Looking back at the collapse of European democracies in the 20th century reveals a blunt historical rule. Post-truth is pre-fascism. When a society collectively decides that nothing is objectively true, it creates a dangerous vacuum. Without a shared baseline of facts, we lose the exact vocabulary needed to criticize the people in power. From there, politics rapidly decays into pure spectacle. The debate floor turns into a reality show, and the biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights. Renouncing the difference between what we want to hear and what is actually the case results in the demise of the individual. This renunciation is the active, willing surrender of personal freedom. In the 1930s, the Romanian playwright Eugen Ionescu found himself watching his highly educated friends, one by one, slip into the language of authoritarianism. He channeled this horror into the play Rhinoceros, depicting a town where ordinary people, caught in the gears of propaganda, transform into giant, mindless beasts. The most terrifying part of this transformation is that it feels entirely natural to the victims. To stop it, we have to recognize the exact symptoms of the infection before it takes hold. Truth doesn't disappear overnight. As scholars of totalitarianism have documented, it is methodically dismantled in 4 specific escalating stages. First is open hostility to reality, presenting inventions as facts. Second is shamanistic incantation, endlessly repeating slogans to bypass critical thought. Next is magical thinking, forcing the public to accept deep contradictions. Finally, misplaced faith,
Truth becomes entirely oratorial, relying solely on a leader's absolute claim. Once a society reaches this final level, objective evidence is completely irrelevant. The mechanics of tyranny are fully locked into place. Slipping into this state of untruth doesn't require secret police or physical violence. Today, the descent is accelerated by the two-dimensional screens we carry in our pockets. We find ourselves trapped in a collective trance. Algorithmic social feeds and relentless television coverage echo the same simplistic cliches, keeping us hypnotized by the spectacle. Because every single update is framed as fast-paced breaking news, we are hit by wave upon wave of information. We lose the larger conceptual framework required to actually process events. This digital ecosystem is perfectly calibrated to pave a frictionless path for authoritarianism. To survive it, resistance has to become a conscious, daily habit. Curing a post-truth society starts with the individual. It requires actively building up a mental armory. Breaking the collective trance requires getting the screens out of our rooms. The two-dimensional digital world limits our vocabulary to a few repeated phrases, while books provide the conceptual framework needed to think outside the present. This mental armory allows us to judge the intentions of others instead of simply reacting to stimuli. The second defense is investigating for yourself. Sometimes people ask, what is truth, with a shrug of generic cynicism. But treating all information as equally flawed is a cowardly excuse to surrender to the status quo. Instead of expecting algorithmic feeds to give you the facts for free, actively subsidize investigative journalism. Real reporting takes time, money, and intense labor. We have to pay for it. We also have to take responsibility for our internet footprint. Sharing unverified information might seem harmless, but it inflicts direct, unseen violence on the minds of your fellow citizens. Daily habits like critical reading and funding journalism serve as vital acts of civic defense. The final requirement of resistance is the willingness to stand out. It feels deeply uncomfortable to do or say something different than the mob around you. In 1940, while much of Europe accommodated a fascist regime and major powers signed treaties, Winston Churchill did what others had not done. He explicitly refused to concede in advance. Churchill stood alone amidst the destruction of the Blitz, refusing to yield to the majority. By forcing Hitler to change his plans when every other power had conceded, he demonstrated that the spell of the status quo only lasts as long as our own compliance. Without that initial unease of stepping out of line, there is no freedom. The moment one person sets a courageous example, the spell of the status quo is broken. The defense of truth ultimately relies on that individual willpower. Many of us grew up with a comforting assumption that liberal democracy is the final, natural destination of human history. This politics of inevitability suggests the system will automatically protect itself, requiring only our passive participation. This passivity creates a profound vulnerability. Democracies rarely collapse overnight in dramatic military coups. Instead, authoritarianism creeps in by gradually separating us from our neighbors, breaking society down into isolated, disconnected individuals. The political theorist Hannah Arendt understood this mechanism. She defined totalitarianism as the deliberate, systematic erasure of the boundary between private and public life. Abandoning our physical communities to live entirely through our screens surrenders the very boundaries that keep us free. A society of isolated individuals scrolling in the dark ceases to be a democracy. It becomes a mob, and a mob is psychologically primed to accept a tyrant. Once society is fractured, tyrants introduce the politics of eternity. They replace actual, complex history with a manufactured longing for a mythic, victimized past. They convince the isolated citizen that the nation is under constant threat, and only a strong man can restore its lost glory. Rebuilding our societal immune system starts with small, banal, everyday actions that we mistakenly assume are apolitical. The absolute prerequisite for political resistance is a secure private life. Nasty rulers will actively seek out what they know about you to push you around. They look for the hook on which to hang you, secrets they can use for blackmail or public humiliation. In the digital age, email is skywriting. Words written in a specific, private context make sense only in that moment. When intelligence agencies or hostile actors steal private messages and drop them into the public sphere, it is an act of deliberate falsification designed to destroy reputations and distract the public. You can deny them these hooks. Scrub your computers of malware on a regular basis. Use encrypted alternatives. And crucially, refuse to consume or share stolen, hacked information masquerading as news. Securing your own hardware and rejecting the salacious exposure of private lives establishes the first line of collective defense against societal manipulation. Resistance must move into the three-dimensional world. The two-dimensional internet is an environment where propaganda and fabricated realities thrive unimpeded. To fight back, we have to practice corporeal politics, moving our physical bodies into public spaces. This begins with the simplest human interactions, making eye contact and small talk with strangers. Acknowledging the people around you actively breaks down the social barriers authoritarians rely on. Survivors of the Soviet purges and fascist Europe often noted this in their memoirs. In moments of intense repression, a simple smile or a word of greeting from a neighbor became an essential barometer of safety. Placing your physical body in unfamiliar places alongside unfamiliar people generates real-world trust. A tyrant can manipulate an algorithm, but they cannot control the social narrative when citizens are actively talking to one another on the street. Physical trust scales outward. It provides the foundation we need to establish civic institutions, contribute to charities, join non-governmental organizations, and eventually march together. We saw this mechanism dismantle communism in Poland in 1980. The Solidarity labor movement succeeded because workers, intellectuals, and religious groups had spent years building a coalition of physical trust. By the time they went on strike, they were a connected civil society that the regime could no longer isolate. Modern authoritarians are highly allergic to free associations. They move to monitor or ban non-governmental organizations because a tightly knit civil network is the only structure capable of withstanding the expansion of the state. This preparation builds towards the ultimate test of a democracy, the arrival of the unthinkable. Authoritarians rely on terror management, exploiting a sudden disaster or shock to declare a permanent state of emergency. In 1933, Adolf Hitler used the arson of the German parliament building, the Reichstag, to suspend basic rights, arrest his political opponents, and consolidate total control. Modern authoritarians repeat these patterns. Leaders like Vladimir Putin have deployed these crisis exploitation tactics to dismantle political opposition and justify wars of aggression. The outcome of a crisis depends on the state of the society experiencing it. An atomized, isolated population will panic and surrender their freedoms for the illusion of safety. A physically connected, resilient society will recognize the manipulation and hold firm. True patriotism has nothing to do with nationalistic pageantry. It is the active, daily courage to hold your country to its highest democratic ideals, especially when doing so feels uncomfortable. History does not automatically repeat itself, but it does instruct. The 20th century provides the necessary lessons to recognize tyranny, allowing us to remain calm and steadfast when the unthinkable arrives. Ordinary citizens determine the survival of a democratic republic through their physical, daily choices.